It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in the small town of San Petro, and an unusual stillness gripped the heart of the community. The once bustling streets now lay empty, the only sounds coming from the cold wind whispering through the trees, stirring an unsettling sense of unease. Even the familiar landmarks seemed to hold their breath, as if anticipating something ominous. At the edge of the town, the towering St. Francis of Assisi Church stood as it always had. A sanctuary of peace, hope, and unwavering faith for the townsfolk. Its time-worn stones, weathered by years of history, and the vibrant stained glass windows, depicting stories of devotion and sacrifice, had long been symbols of solace for those seeking refuge. Yet, on this particular day, something different lingered in the air, something darker, a heavy unease that even the church's sacred walls couldn't dispel. Inside the church, Father Michael, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a serene gaze that had always comforted his congregation, was quietly preparing the altar for the evening mass. The usually warm and welcoming space, a place of refuge for so many, seemed shrouded in shadows, its tranquility now replaced by a tense, unspoken dread. Over the past several months, a wave of violence and intimidation had swept through San Petro, disturbing the once peaceful rhythms of everyday life. Father Michael himself had become the target of anonymous threats, letters warning him to abandon his mission of helping the poor and the needy. But despite the ominous warnings and the fear they tried to instill, he never wavered in his commitment. His faith remained unshaken, grounded in the belief that no matter how dark the world seemed, the light of God would always find a way to pierce through the shadows. As Father Michael adjusted the candlesticks on the altar, his thoughts were momentarily interrupted by the sudden creak of the church's wooden doors, breaking the eerie silence that had enveloped the space. The heavy, echoing sound sent a chill through the air, and two figures stepped into the church. Their silhouettes were stark against the soft glow of the stained glass windows, their dark clothing and threatening expressions casting a shadow on the serene surroundings. To most, they were strangers, but to Father Michael, they were all too familiar. These were the same men who had been lurking around the church for weeks, trying to intimidate the faithful, attempting to drive them away with violence and fear. Whispers of their ties to a criminal syndicate hoping to seize control of the town for their illicit operations had spread like wildfire. And Father Michael had heard the rumors, he had even received warnings from his own parishioners. The two men approached him slowly, their footsteps deliberate and heavy. One of them, a scarred man with a cruel, mocking smile on his face, spoke in a voice laced with venom. "Father," he began, his words dripping with contempt, "I think we've made it clear that we don't want you here anymore. This town doesn't belong to you. You've got one choice. Either you leave for good, or..." His voice trailed off, leaving the threat hanging in the air, his eyes gleaming with silent malice. Father Michael's heart raced, but his posture remained steady, unyielding. He knew that he wasn't alone, not truly. His faith had always been his fortress, and though fear tried to creep into his mind, he did not allow it to take root. He met the man's gaze, his voice calm yet firm. "This is a house of God," he said, his words clear and strong. "As long as I am here, this church will remain a refuge for all who seek it. You have no right to take that away from the people of this town." The second man, bulkier and colder than the first, stepped forward, his eyes like ice. He pulled a gun from beneath his coat, the cold, metallic glint catching the candlelight and casting a sinister glow across the church walls. "You don't get it, Father," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Today is your last chance." For a brief moment, Father Michael felt a surge of fear, but it was fleeting. The reality of the situation, the weapon pointed at him, was undeniable. Yet, deep within, he knew he could not back down. To do so would be to betray everything he had ever stood for, everything the people had entrusted to him. He closed his eyes for a moment, silently praying for strength and protection from above. But just as the tension seemed unbearable, something unexpected happened. A soft sound echoed through the church, the unmistakable padding of paws against the cold marble floor. Father Michael, the men, and even the few parishioners who were present turned in unison toward the source of the sound. In the center aisle, moving slowly but deliberately toward the altar, was a small figure, a cat. The feline, with sleek, dark gray fur and piercing emerald green eyes, exuded an air of quiet nobility. None of them knew where it had come from. Some of the parishioners vaguely remembered seeing it wander the church grounds in the past few days, but never this close to the altar. Never with such a sense of purpose. The cat stopped, positioning itself directly between Father Michael and the armed men. Its gaze, calm yet intense, seemed to pierce through the very heart of the confrontation. The man with the gun, puzzled and unnerved, muttered under his breath, "What the hell is that?" The cat did not move but let out a deep, resonant meow, low and filled with warning. The sound reverberated through the walls of the church, as if the very building itself was rallying behind the priest. For a brief moment, the air seemed to shift, as though something invisible and powerful had begun to stir. Father Michael looked at the cat, and in that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. There was no more fear, only a deep certainty. Somehow, he knew the animal was there for a reason, a sign, perhaps, of divine protection. He knelt slowly, making the sign of the cross, his heart filled with gratitude. "My God, thank you for sending an angel in such an unexpected form," he whispered. The two men exchanged confused glances, their previous confidence and aggression faltering as they struggled to understand the strange turn of events. They had come to the church with the intention of instilling fear. But now, they were confronted by a presence that none of them could comprehend. The larger man, still holding the gun, sneered, trying to shake off the discomfort that had settled in his chest. "Get away, you stupid animal," he shouted, aiming the weapon at the cat, trying to scare it off. But the cat didn't flinch. Instead, it took another deliberate step forward, never breaking eye contact with the man. And then, something inexplicable happened. The lights inside the church, which had been flickering softly in the dim space, suddenly flared to life, glowing brighter than before. A gust of wind swept through the open door, causing the candles to dance and the stained glass windows to shimmer, as if the church itself was responding to the challenge. The men hesitated, their once confident postures now stiff with unease. They had come in with the intent to instill fear. But now, that fear seemed to be turning against them. The cat, small and seemingly fragile, had become the focal point of the scene, and the atmosphere around them hummed with an energy they couldn't explain. The scarred man, whose hands had once been steady, began to tremble as he raised his gun, his voice wavering. "It's just a cat," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. His grip tightened around the weapon, but his fingers trembled uncontrollably. He could not pull the trigger. Father Michael, witnessing the scene unfold before him, realized that something miraculous was happening. The threats the men had brought with them, their intimidation, their malice, seemed to crumble in the presence of that small, unassuming creature. He felt a surge of emotion, a swell of gratitude and awe. His heart burned with unshed tears as he silently prayed, his voice a whisper filled with reverence. "Lord, if this is a sign, help us to understand. Protect us all." The moment seemed to stretch on forever, the silence broken only by the tense breaths of those watching. The larger man took a step back, his eyes wide with fear. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice faltering, but his partner, still trying to convince himself, snapped, "It's just a cat." Yet the ferocity in his voice had completely disappeared. His words were hollow, and the fear in his eyes was undeniable. While the men argued, the cat, as if understanding the shift in the power dynamic, silently leapt onto one of the nearby pews. Its movements were graceful, precise, like a dancer. It moved slowly toward the front pew, positioning itself directly in front of the men. With regal poise, it sat, lifting its head high, and then, as if to emphasize its newfound dominance in the situation, the cat let out a deep, resonant meow, a sound that echoed through the church like thunder. Vibrating off the walls, the sound grew in intensity, filling every corner of the space. Father Michael, feeling a newfound strength surge within him, rose to his feet. "You have no power here," he declared, his voice firm and full of authority. "This house belongs to the Lord, and by His grace, this place is protected." The two men froze, the fear that had once been theirs now shifting onto their own shoulders. Something in Father Michael's eyes, combined with the unwavering presence of the small cat, seemed to carry a weight they could not confront. Slowly, the larger man lowered his weapon, his trembling hands betraying his fear. It was as if the entire scene had transformed into a nightmare he could not escape. "What's happening?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. His partner, even more shaken, began to stumble backward, tripping over one of the pews and falling to his knees on the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence, And at that very moment, the cat, with an almost divine sense of timing, leapt from the pew and landed softly beside him. The surreal sight of a heavily armed man, feared by many, now kneeling before a simple cat, was almost too much to comprehend. The small feline looked down at the man, its gaze seemingly judgmental, yet filled with a mysterious tenderness. The silence that followed was all-consuming. No one moved. The few parishioners hiding in the corners of the church watched the scene with bated breath. It was as if an invisible battle was being waged in that very moment, not one of physical strength, but a spiritual war, with the small cat as an unexpected warrior. "Stop! Stop!" the man on his knees murmured, his voice breaking as he dropped his gun to the floor with a loud clatter. His eyes brimmed with tears. Tears he could no longer hold back. The weight of his actions, the terror that had controlled him, seemed to break open, flooding him with emotions he had long suppressed. The cat, its gaze never wavering, tilted its head to one side. There was something deeply compassionate in its eyes, as if offering silent forgiveness, as if acknowledging the man's sorrow. It was as if the cat, in all its simplicity, had touched the deepest part of his soul. The kneeling man's sobs grew louder, his body trembling with emotion, as he seemed to break down under the weight of the moment. The room was thick with tension, but it wasn't fear anymore, it was something far more profound. A crack in his hardened soul had appeared, and in that crack, there was a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: vulnerability. "I can't do this anymore," he cried, his voice thick with sorrow. "I don't know what it is. But this cat, he knows. He knows everything. It's like he's telling me there's still a chance for me to change." Father Michael, standing still with his heart pounding in his chest, had always believed in the transformative power of forgiveness and redemption, but he had never expected it to manifest in such an unexpected and almost miraculous way. He had always preached about hope, but this moment, with the weight of the two men and their fear and anger, was a living testament to the very things he believed. He stepped forward, moving slowly toward the kneeling man. His voice was calm but firm, filled with the conviction of a man who knew that sometimes redemption could come when least expected. "You don't have to follow this path," Father Michael said softly, his words cutting through the chaos. "There are other choices. You have the opportunity to leave this behind and seek a better life." The second man, standing a few paces behind, seemed conflicted. He glanced at his partner, then at the priest, and finally, his eyes fell on the cat, whose steady gaze seemed to have a magnetic pull on him. He hesitated, caught in an internal struggle. The dark figure before him, the cat, had become something more than just an animal. It felt as though the cat's presence was speaking directly to the turmoil in his own heart. The cat, sensing the hesitation, took a step forward, moving gracefully until its paw gently touched the kneeling man's leg. The touch was electric, a gentle yet unmistakable signal. The moment the cat made contact, the air seemed to shift, and the kneeling man's entire body shuddered as if a heavy burden was being lifted. He looked up at Father Michael, his voice breaking as tears poured from his eyes. I can't do this anymore," he repeated, his words barely a whisper. His hands, scarred and calloused from years of violence, reached out with trembling fingers toward the cat, as if longing for connection, for understanding. The feline, in all its simplicity, allowed it. The rough hand brushed against the warm, soft fur of the animal, and the man dissolved into uncontrollable sobs, his body shaking with raw emotion. "I can't do this anymore," he repeated, his voice now hoarse, a mantra of grief. Father Michael, kneeling beside him, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension radiating from the man like heat from a fire. "You can change," Father Michael whispered, his voice filled with compassion. "God brought you here for this moment so that you could see there is still hope. Leave the darkness behind. You can choose a different life." The man, his face stained with tears, bowed his head, his hands still resting on the cat's back as if it were the only source of stability in the world. The church, which had once been a place of fear, intimidation, and threats, now seemed to breathe with a new energy. Something akin to peace began to take root in the space, a sense of renewal that filled the air with a calming presence. Yet, the story was far from over. The little dark grey cat, still calmly positioned beside the kneeling man, seemed to understand that this was not the end of his mission. There was still more to be done, and the true climax had yet to unfold. The man, who was still on his knees, sobbing like a child, had been touched by something much greater than himself. Meanwhile, the other intruder, the scarred man, began to back away slowly, his eyes fixed on the cat. It was as if the very presence of the feline had stirred up something deep within him, fears and secrets that he had spent years burying. The cat, however, remained still, its green eyes never leaving the scarred man's face, tracking every subtle shift in his posture. The air in the church was no longer heavy with fear. Instead, it was thick with something else, a strange, almost indescribable feeling of renewal, of change. It was as if the very fabric of the room had shifted. The scarred man, still trying to resist, muttered to himself, "I won't give in to this," as if trying to convince himself of his own resolve. His voice was raspy, full of conflict, but the more he fought it, the more it felt as if something beyond his control was slowly seeping into his heart. He had been taught, since childhood, to fear weakness, to never show fear, to always be strong. He had built his life on violence and intimidation. But now, in the presence of this small creature, his entire world felt as though it were coming undone. With each step backward, he felt a growing unease that he couldn't shake. His heart raced, his mind screamed at him to leave, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. And then, at that very moment, a sound unlike any other filled the church. Bells began to toll. Loud and clear, their deep resonant chimes breaking the heavy silence. It was the bell from the tower, one that usually rang only during Mass or on special occasions. Yet now, it rang by itself, filling the space with a sound that seemed to come from another realm entirely. Father Michael's eyes widened in surprise, his heart stirring with awe. The few parishioners who remained in the church began to murmur low prayers, overcome by a sense of reverence that they couldn't explain. The scarred man, his face twisted with panic and disbelief, looked up at the bell, then back at the cat, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. "What's happening here?" he shouted, pointing his gun upward in a desperate attempt to stop the sound, as though he could silence the divine presence that seemed to be filling the church. But the bell continued to toll, each chime growing louder and more powerful, echoing through the walls like a call from another world. Then, at the peak of the bell's celestial sound, the cat finally stood up. The graceful feline moved with a deliberate slowness, its green eyes fixed on the scarred man. With each step, it seemed to carry an aura of power, something that transcended the physical world. The cat's presence became more than just an animal in the church, it had become a messenger, a conduit for something divine, something that could not be ignored. "Stop!" the scarred man cried out, taking more unsteady steps back. "Stay away from me." But the cat moved on, undeterred by the fear that gripped the man. Its steps were quiet, but each one seemed to carry a weight far greater than its size. The faithful, still kneeling and witnessing this extraordinary moment, could only watch with tear-filled eyes. The presence of the small cat seemed to awaken something deep inside each of them, a part of their soul they didn't even know existed. Something that stirred with deep empathy and recognition. The scarred man, his hands shaking as he continued to retreat, was no longer in control of his own actions. The small cat, undeterred and calm, continued its approach, unafraid. When the man finally reached the edge of the church, with nowhere else to retreat, he took a final step back and let out a desperate cry. But the feline, still calm and steady, did not stop. It was as if the cat's very presence had shattered the man's hardened exterior, revealing a rawness and fragility that had been buried for so long. And then, in a moment that seemed to last an eternity, the scarred man fell to his knees, his body trembling with a mix of fear and surrender. In the silence that followed, no one moved. The cat, with an almost regal poise, remained in front of him, its gaze unwavering, and the man, for the first time in years, began to weep, not from anger or violence, but from a deep, aching sorrow that had been hidden beneath the surface. The church, once filled with fear and darkness, now became a place of transformation, of spiritual renewal. It was as if the divine had entered the room, not through grandeur or glory, but through the simple, unassuming presence of a small, dark gray cat. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the church, where guilt, regret, and the haunting specter of the past collided with the flickering hope of redemption. The bulkier man, still on his knees and overcome with emotion, gazed up at his companion with desperation written all over his face. "Please," he whispered, his voice thick with pain. "Enough." We shouldn't be here. I feel like this place is sacred. His words trembled, as if speaking the truth of what he was experiencing had the power to shatter everything he'd built up over the years. His companion scoffed, looking down at him with contempt. His voice empty and devoid of conviction. Sacred? It's just an old church. His words were an attempt to cling to the last vestiges of his pride. Yet deep down, he knew it wasn't true. There was something about this place. Something about the way it wrapped around them like a warm, invisible cloak, that transcended mere stone, stained glass, and timber. It was as though the church itself had become a sanctuary not only for the weary and faithful but for those lost in their own darkness. And the cat, this small, seemingly insignificant creature, was somehow the key to unlocking it all. Every step the cat took felt like a silent judgment. Every movement seemed to echo the painful memories that the men had tried so desperately to bury. Father Michael, sensing the turmoil within the scarred man's eyes, moved forward, his hands trembling. This was the moment. Something inside him told him that he had to act now, that he had to speak the words that might break through the final veil of darkness clouding the man's heart. The priest, with his quiet authority, spoke gently but with an unmistakable urgency. You think you're strong, Father Michael said, his voice filled with emotion. But strength is not in violence. It's not in overpowering others. It's in facing your own demons. It takes courage to change, no matter what you've done. God is here, waiting for you. Today, He is giving you a new chance. Just one step away from the darkness. The scarred man squeezed his eyes shut, the priest's words slicing through the mental armor he'd built around himself. The cat's gaze, unflinching and calm, pierced through him like an invisible force. It felt as though he were exposed. His past, his sins, laid bare before him. He thought of the lives he had ruined, the people he had hurt, and the guilt began to swell inside him like a tide rising with unstoppable force. A question bubbled up, something he had never dared ask before. What if there was hope? What if somehow, he could still be forgiven? This is a trap, he murmured, almost to himself, more out of fear than conviction. I can't do it. The cat, steady and unwavering, stopped just a few feet away from him. Its eyes never left his face. Then, in a quiet, reverent moment, the feline bowed its head and closed its eyes, as if in prayer. The gesture was simple, yet it carried an unspoken power, one that the scarred man felt deep within his chest. In that instant, he felt his legs give way beneath him. The gun slipped from his hand, clattering to the marble floor, and he collapsed onto his knees, his body trembling with a wave of emotion he had never experienced before. And then, as if the very air held its breath, the bell in the tower ceased ringing, and an absolute silence enveloped the church. The tension that had built up during the confrontation, the weight of fear and regret, seemed to evaporate, replaced by a profound stillness. The scarred man whispered, his voice barely audible through the tears that began to stream down his face. I'm so sorry. His words were raw, drenched in sorrow, and as they left his mouth, it was as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The cat opened its eyes and, for a fleeting moment, it almost seemed to smile. There was something comforting in that look, something that said, it's okay, you still have a chance to choose the right path. Father Michael moved closer, kneeling beside the man, placing a gentle hand on his trembling shoulder. The choice is yours, he said softly, his voice filled with compassion. If you want to, you can stand up now and walk out of here as a free man, free from the chains you've wrapped around your own soul. Just accept the forgiveness that is being offered to you. The man, still kneeling and shaking, looked at Father Michael, then at the cat. His eyes told the story of a battle fought within his soul, a battle between his sins, his guilt, and the faint flicker of hope that the priest and the cat had awakened in him. He sighed deeply, his chest rising with the weight of the decision. Finally, with a soft whisper, he spoke, I accept. The cat, sensing the decision, moved forward, brushing its head gently against the man's hand. The soft touch was barely perceptible, yet it carried an overwhelming weight. The man felt the darkness within him begin to dissipate. The weight on his chest lifted, and for the first time in years, he felt the chains of guilt loosen. He looked up, his tears flowing freely. Thank you, he whispered, the words filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. Father Michael, moved beyond words, smiled gently. The night that had seemed destined for tragedy had transformed into one of redemption. All because of this small, unassuming cat. The church, which had once been filled with fear, was now awash in light, a light that had been reignited by the courage of an unexpected messenger. But the cat, standing still beside the kneeling man, knew that there was more to come. Somehow, it seemed to understand that the true climax of its mission had not yet arrived. The church, once darkened by fear and hostility, now pulsed with a tangible sense of hope and renewal. The two men, who had entered with weapons and ill intentions, were now kneeling, their aggression stripped away, their pride gone. Father Michael, witnessing the transformation, felt an overwhelming wave of relief wash over him. In all his years of ministry, he had seen many things, many miracles, but none as profound as this. The cat, pacing calmly between the two men, seemed like a silent guardian, watching over them. Its every movement, slow and graceful, exuded a peace that began to seep into the very hearts of those around it. Even the parishioners, who had been hiding in the corners, began to emerge slowly, their faces filled with wonder and deep emotion. The cat's presence had done what no weapon, no harsh word, or threat could. It had transformed fear into faith, violence into peace. As the scarred man, now visibly shaken, muttered to himself in a hoarse voice, "I won't give in to this." The bells of the church tolled once more. It was the bell from the tower, a sound that usually rang only during Mass or special occasions. Yet now, it rang on its own, filling the space with a sound that seemed to transcend time and space itself. Father Michael, his eyes wide in astonishment, watched as the bell's deep, resonant chimes echoed through the church. The sound felt like a call, a divine affirmation of what had just transpired. The parishioners, overcome by an inexplicable sense of reverence, murmured quiet prayers. The scarred man, his face a mask of panic and disbelief, looked up at the bell, then at the cat, his mind struggling to process the events unfolding before him. "What's happening here?" he shouted, his voice strained as he pointed his gun upward in a futile attempt to stop the tolling sound. But the bell continued to ring, louder and more powerful with each chime. And as the bells reached their peak, the cat, unwavering in its quiet authority, stood and walked toward the scarred man, its paws barely making a sound on the marble floor. There was something regal about the way it moved, something that made the man's heart race with fear. It was as if the small creature, in its silent, determined approach, was carrying with it the weight of the divine. "Stop!" the scarred man shouted, taking several shaky steps back. "Stay away from me." But the cat continued to move forward, undeterred by his shouts. The air in the church seemed to crackle with energy, a palpable sense of something larger than them all. The faithful who remained, still kneeling, watched with tear-filled eyes. It was as if the cat, through its simple yet powerful presence, had awakened something deep within each of them, a feeling of hope, of faith, and of possibility.